Hello, my name is Michael Green, and I welcome you to today's episode of my podcast Historians in Conversation, which is hosted by the University of Lodz in Poland. My guest today is Dr. Frode Hatlen, head of Department of Historical and Classical Studies at the University of Trondheim, which is located in Norway. Frode has decided to become a historian already at the age of 11, and today we will be talking about how he managed to fulfill his dream of becoming an academic. We'll be talking about his motivations, his decisions, the way that he constructed his career, but also we'll be talking about Norwegian higher education and the way that Norwegian universities hire their academic staff. I welcome Jan Frode to my podcast, and I hope that you enjoy our conversation today. Jan Frode, welcome to my podcast, Historians in Conversation. I'm very happy to have you here.
It's my pleasure to be here, and thanks for inviting me.
Thank you. You are coming from the University of Trondheim in Norway, which is a pretty beautiful place, I would say, in Northern Europe. I've been there once, and I will be there once again in February, of which I'm
Really?
very glad. And I wanted to talk to you about your academic career and your interest in history. And traditionally, I always start my podcast with asking questions about your childhood and your background. So perhaps you could tell a little bit, where do you come from? Who were your parents? And what kind of milieu you were growing up in?
So I'm a local guy from Trondheim. I grew up right in the middle of the city. My parents were not scholars of any kind, so I don't have an academic background from the family side. My sister has also chosen to do an academic career, so she has also got a PhD and works as an associate professor at the same university, the Norwegian University of Science and Technology. She's in the health faculty, so she has a somewhat different career, but we both ended up as academics, even though our parents were not. So my mother finished.
Older sister or younger?
Yes, that's my older sister. So I wouldn't say I take pride in it, but of course, as a competing younger brother, it was fun to be the first to do a PhD. But she is a brilliant scholar, so I'm a very admiring younger brother for the time. I am. But we ended up with academic careers, the both of us, even though our parents didn't have any education at all. Even though it did make a matter that my mother was a student counselor at the university. So that was a good source of information growing up. And that did have an effect on my choices in school, and especially on my choices of subjects in upper secondary school.
And when you were a child, do you remember a point when you realized that history is something that fascinates you? Or maybe was it not really in the childhood, but in your teenage years?
Actually, I was 11 when I decided to become a historian. And that was partly because of my mother. As I grew up, Trondheim was an important city for the Nazis when they occupied Norway. And they had, of course, a lot of collaborators in the area. And one Norwegian collaborator had a house known as a place of crazy parties and a lot of torture, and a really scary house when you grow up around it. And we drove by that house every second Sunday when we came back from the football match in our area. So I could see the house, and my parents mentioned that this is a house where a lot of bad things happened. And I became curious, and I found a lot of books in our house about the resistance in the area. And that was it. Spent the next years from I was about 10 to 13, 14, reading about the resistance in Trøndelag, the area, the region around Trondheim, and was fascinated by all these stories about resistance, people who escaped from torture in that house and hid in the backyards of the houses around my own house. So I could sort of, when I went out, I could see sort of the trees where people hid from torture. So that was, as a young kid, that was sort of an exciting and scary history that was true. And then my mother told me when I was around 11 that you can actually make a living writing history. And I was surprised. Okay, so you can do this as a job, reading books that I find exciting. That can actually be my source of income. So I just decided, yeah, that's what I'll do. And I never really strayed from that. During middle school and upper secondary, I did have some thoughts about social sciences and other subjects, but I always came back to the idea that I wanted to study history. So that was the beginning, and perhaps because of a lack of creativity, I just stuck to what I decided on when I was 10, 11 years old. But yeah, that was the beginning, and here I am.
And what did your father do?
He sold chocolate.
Ah,
So he sold chocolate when I was a kid. He sold chocolate. He was his head sales manager for the biggest chocolate factory in Norway. So he
yeah.
was a real Jap who traveled around in the 80s in conventions for salespersons and stuff like that, and yeah, a real high paced selling job, managing a lot of money and stuff like that. Then he decided to create his own firm when I finished high school, and he sold chocolate in the vending machines for universities and stuff like that. So he created his own firm. So he sold chocolate from he was in his 20s to until his retirement.
Well, I think that's a pretty cool job, I would say. And it's pretty cool to be a kid of a father who sells chocolate.
To this day, I don't eat chocolate. I became so sick of it when I was a kid. So it can get too much as well.
I must say that my mother worked for half a year for a chocolate factory, but yeah, it was a very brief period.
Yeah.
I could never get enough of it.
Yeah. The chocolate factory is on the other side of my elementary school. So whenever we had Christmas or summer, last the last class before for vacation, I could just walk over to the other side of the street and just say hello. And the people on the front desk, they would know that I was the son of one of the sales managers, and I could just get a big carrying bag with sweets that I could bring back to my class. And yeah, so those were the 2 days during the year I was the most popular in class. So it's coming back from a break with yeah, bags with sweets.
But I think what is interesting that you mentioned two things that nowadays might seem very contradictory to people. One was the fact that your parents were not really educated, but then that you had a lot of books at home. And I think it's interesting because nowadays we find a lot of homes without any books at all.
Yeah,
Back in the day, it was some kind of pride. I remember it in my childhood that people would show off their books. They would be in
yeah,
the living room, not
yeah,
only in the office, but also in the living room. And nowadays, this idea is somehow changed, and a lot of people don't possess any books.
yeah.
So, do you think that in your family in particular, reading was an important part, even though there was no formal education, the self-learning was some part of your family tradition?
Yeah. I think reading was, I think especially my mother thought that me reading was very good, and she encouraged me to read more. And of course, I read other things than just history as well. And I also always received books when I wanted books. That wasn't, and if I wanted some football gear, I might be forced to wait for it or something like that. But books I could always get, and that's something I've brought on to my own family. Uh, I don't give my children everything they want, but if they want books, I never say no. So that was important, and we also had lexica and dictionaries and those kind of books in the shelves, and that was important, I think, for my mother to have those things and updated as well. So I think that was something especially in the 80s, that people took pride in having those kind of books that we now only have online. I don't think I don't know anyone who buys lexica anymore, and dictionaries and stuff like that. They just use the ones online. So that's perhaps something we lost in the way. But books and reading and having a good pace in reading, that's important, of course, for historians, and it's important that children today also read enough to get that pace if they want to study history later on. So that was
Yeah,
important in our house, definitely. At the same time, I think there were many coincidences. I found a lot of books in a cupboard that my uncle left behind because I grew up in the house where my mother grew up, and she has an older brother. And I found his old cupboard, and it was packed with books from the 50s and Hardy Boys books and the Bob's Children books and stuff like that, but also some more or less crime books from the war, and where the plot was set in the war. So it was exciting for me just to find books from the 50s. So I think I read most of them. I still have some of them.
I also think that perhaps the environment itself, you mentioned Second World War and what was going on in Trondheim, but there's also this medieval part of Trondheim, which I assume you were visiting when you were a child. And I
Yeah,
wonder if you think that it also made some impression on you or created some fascination with history, because you are actually studying ancient history.
yeah.
And I wonder if you were already thinking at the time about it, because you mentioned only the contemporary part of it.
Mm,
But I wonder, when did you start to be interested in the really old past? Well, I
mm,
think for a child, Middle Ages, it's already quite ancient
yeah.
history.
Well, it's the Middle Ages are in some respects visible in our area, not from the Middle Ages, except for the cathedral. But most of it are, we have places of memory created in the 19th and early 20th century about the Middle Ages. So in that respect, it's quite visible for a child growing up here. And I did go to, there's this outdoor play that's put up every year in the summer about the death of King Olav, the holy king, the marcher, which is very important for the making of the Norwegian kingdom. Uh, it was an important figure in bringing Christianity to Norway, and it's his regal axe that's in the crest for that Norway has. So it's a very important figure, and there's this play, and I remember going to this play in the 80s, and I can't remember much of the play apart from the king riding in on a horse, and the fact that King Olaf V, who was king when I was a child, attended the play on the same day. So he was the guest of honor, at the time. So I can remember those things, but I didn't set out to study pre-modern history. I thought I was going to study modern history. But when I came to the university, I was frustrated because I didn't understand where did this modern society come from? Why did it look like it did? Why were the maps like they were? And so I started to just go further and further and deeper and deeper into to the society that preceded whatever I was studying. So I became quickly interested in medieval history. But then I got frustrated because I didn't understand what this Middle Age was. Why did we call it the Middle Ages? And I started studying ancient history. And when I was finished studying ancient history, I had studied for so long, I had a degree. So yeah, so it was just a frustration and curiosity about whatever preceded the things I were looking at. And if I had in an indefinite time as a student, I would probably keep going back further and further. But yeah, when I was done with ancient history, I had a degree. So yeah,
So,
not a great plan, in other words, but it just turned out that way.
so in fact, you didn't really choose to study ancient history consciously, but the idea to go and to study at a university, that was probably an idea that you had for some time. So you mentioned that at the age of 11, you decided to be a historian, but some historians don't really ever go to university and just write historical novels, being good writers,
Yeah,
doing some small research in the library. And
yeah.
the decision to study at the university, especially if your parents didn't do that, was it something that was on your mind? Was it maybe something that your parents wanted for you? Because I know that in some families it's very important for the parents that their children go to do this formal education.
Yeah, so this is the important context is that I'm born in the late 70s and grew up in the 90s, and that was a period of a lot of school reforms in Norway. So almost everyone I grew up with had decided very early on to go to university. So it was more a matter of what we were pursuing in university rather than whether or not we were going to university. So the discussions among my friends and I were about whether or not to follow money or interest, and I decided to follow my interests rather than money. I think I'm the only one of my friends who went to humanities, and the rest of my friends went more to business schools and stuff like that.
And then during your studies, you decided to continue to masters and then to PhD. And again, was it something that was a conscious choice, or it was, for me, for example, it was not really a conscious choice because I finished my bachelor's degree and I thought, well, what do I do next? And I thought, well, the next thing is to do masters. Then I was finished with my masters and I discussed with my master supervisor, what should I do next? Yeah, what are the options? And she said, well, you should probably do a PhD. And I said, okay. So it was not my goal ever to do a PhD when I started, not even during my master's. I just wanted to get master's degree. I thought it was cool to have
Yeah.
this MA, but PhD was by chance. Then when I decided that I want to do it, then I made, of course, efforts to get a scholarship and to study. And I wonder, how was it for you?
For me, it was a goal to get a PhD and a position in university. So I made choices as a student that made sense at the time to have a career. And if I was a student today, I would make other choices because other things are important to have a career now than what the situation was 20 years ago. So it was a goal. But I met this person that made a very big difference for me, and that was the Emperor Augustus, because during my I have this old type of masters where we did a lot more research. So when I did that masters for a couple of years, and there were no courses at all at that time, just an academic thesis, which is which was quite substantial compared to what we do today. And I really got under Emperor Augustus's skin, and I think that sensation that you can, I think I could get an understanding of what kind of person he was, and perhaps it's not as humble a thing to say as it should be, but I think I got a better understanding of Emperor Augustus than most of the biographers that I could read. Most of the books I've read about him, I think they've underestimated some part of his personality, and just the sensation of understanding something properly, that was really intriguing for me. So it became very important for me to sort of make a career of understanding history in that as deep as I felt I did at the time. And of course, the results, the grades and stuff like that, that project led to, that was really helpful. And also the support that I received from people at the department after that thesis was important. But I remember how it felt at the end of that project, where I really got the feeling that this is something I know properly. That was inspirational.
Augustus is an inspirational figure, and one of my seminar papers during my bachelor's degree was on Augustus, and I found him fascinating.
Mm. And Trondheim has a classics section in our department, and they've always had an emphasis on the golden age, the authors and poets of his time. So when I studied Latin, there was a lot of help here, yeah, getting the nuances of that time period and so on. So it was a really good place to study Augustus and his time, and it still is. We have a brilliant professor in Latin here who has done tremendous research on Ovid. So it's still a good place. It's a bit weird going to the north studying Roman poets, of course, but it's a really good place to come to study uh, the poets of Augustus's era.
And then you finished the master's, and what happened next? When was this? When was the opportunity to do a PhD, and how did you choose the supervisor, or if the supervisor actually chose you?
Yeah, so then came a couple of years of trying to get funding for a PhD. In Norway, you have to have a position at the university to do a PhD, so you need a fellowship, and those tend to be very competitive. So I used a couple of years getting the proposal good enough to get that fellowship. So during that time, I worked at the university as a student counselor, and I taught classes. And that was really helpful. And the experience I got teaching those classes uh, would later on prove to be very important for me in terms of getting a position here. So that was really, it could seem as a tipping point in my career, in the sense that I could have ended up in a normal job outside of academia, because I just couldn't get the funding for a couple of years. But I stuck to it for a while, and it turned out well. But I didn't do much academic work for those 2 years. So that was a period that where I sort of felt a little bit of anxiety about where I would end up. And I wanted to pursue the idea of power in Roman society more. So I wrote a proposal about that with the same supervisor that I had in my master's. So I got funding, and then I found out that my supervisor had a big project and was occupied with that. So I changed supervisors, and I decided that understanding power in Roman society didn't need to be about politics. So I discovered how interesting it is to understand power in Roman society, starting with the first component in society, as Cicero put it, which is the family. And studying power relations in the Roman family, I then discovered how comparable it is with other societies in contemporary societies. And I've always had an interest of politics, and I've actually been a politician. So I discovered that I could combine that interest I have with society, the society I live in, and my interest in history. And so a new project developed in the process about honor, shame, and power in the Roman family. And then, of course, it became even more interesting if I could do it in a later time period in the transition between Roman society and the early Middle Ages. So it became a thesis about honor and domestic violence in the late Roman family in the Latin West. So that was my thesis, my dissertation for the PhD. So it developed very gradually, and it changed a lot in the process, and I'm very happy for it.
How many years did you do the PhD? What was the period?
Yeah, so not just the thesis and the project changed on the ways, but a lot of the circumstances changed in the process. So my interest in teaching developed a lot in these years. I was able to teach my own courses as a fellow at the department. This gave me new opportunities. So during this process, an opening also appeared at the department where I didn't need a PhD to get the position. So I actually abandoned my funding and my fellowship to get a position at the department before I had defended my thesis. So from start to end, it took me 6 years, almost 7 actually. In the meantime, I also had my first child, so I also had a paternity leave. So a lot of things happened and changed on the ways. So when I defended my thesis in 2015, I had a permanent position at the department. I had responsibility for the teacher education at the department, and had a lot of teaching duties. I had a son and a wife, and a lot of other tasks and duties and responsibilities. So the circumstances had changed a lot from being sort of a geek looking at only specific subjects in history to being a part, a member of a department, which is quite different from just being a researcher at a department. So I became a much broader academic in those years, and that was also important for me to. It became instrumental in the process where I was hired.
I think that your career path is really different from anyone I spoke to in this podcast until now, because none of the people that I spoke to actually had a permanent job before the PhD, and many of them were looking for a job for quite some time after the PhD. So it's pretty interesting how different those career paths can be, and how different the opportunities are. But I think you really made conscious choices about it, and that's something that one needs to keep in mind, that it's good to decide early on what you want to do
Mm.
and
I
how
think,
to achieve it. Yeah.
yeah, it's a quite unique career, but I think that I've always been set on the goal that I wanted to work in a department because I think because I think this is a very good place to be. But there are other ways to do history as well. But I would really like to be a member of a department, and so I was very keen on grabbing the opportunities that came along. So there were a lot of minor steps on the process here where I always said yes to the opportunities that arose, and I tend to say yes to everything. So I said yes to talking with you, and I
Thank you.
say yes, and I'm enjoying it very much. But I say yes to a lot of things that come along because I see that having said yes to people before tend to give new opportunities. Um, so when I finished my master's, I said yes to doing a lot of teaching that was not very good paid. It didn't give me a contract or anything. It gave me they paid me a fee after I did the job, um, and I got an office that I could share with a friend of mine who did his master's at the same time. But yeah, it was really a cheap solution for the university, and but I didn't mind because I got to do history in some respects. I could teach. That was good. And there have been so many times where I have been able to say yes to people, and yeah, it pays off. So I still do that. I say yes when people ask me if I could do something, if I'm available for a talk or grading at another university or evaluating, assessing people who apply for positions in other universities and so on. So I participate in committees. Uh, I almost never say no because it pays off to have been involved. So it's in some respects it's networking, and in other respects it's getting experience that a lot of other people won't have when you apply for something because it gives me a very very broad profile.
That's true. I think about my talk to Anne Lahtinen from the University of Helsinki, and she said that her mother gave her the advice of networking if she wants to pursue an academic career. And I thought, and well, we discussed it with her, that it was a great advice that she was given. And you are repeating it, that networking is very important, and also, of course, broad skills and taking opportunities even if they are not very convenient. So I think those things, they need to be spelled out in order
Yeah,
for people to hear that that's what's important.
yeah.
And now you are head of department at the university
Mm.
and at the history department, but it's combined, right? Archaeology,
Yeah,
history, and
historical and classical studies.
yeah.
So we have a lot of study programs. We have archaeology, history, teach education in history, European studies, cultural heritage studies, and classics.
It's a quite a broad program. I think that you actually have more to offer in history than the University of Oslo, from what I know.
Yeah, I can't comment on that.
Regarding, well, that's my comment regarding the historical periods, which is interesting because Trondheim is not the first name that comes in one's mind when we think about outside of Norway. I mean, when we think about Norway, then we think about University of Oslo. But it's good that such university exists in the north and it has such nice offer. And now that you are on the other side of the job hunt and on the other side of academic career, when you have already established academic career, a permanent one, maybe you could tell us a little bit how does it work in Norway? How the hiring processes work and what is important?
Mm. So the hiring processes have changed a lot in the last 15 years. My academic career wouldn't have been possible today. So if I was young today, I would be needed to have done things differently. So saying yes to teaching would perhaps not be as important as saying yes to being part of workshops where people start off new projects. So the hiring process here is divided into two halves. The first half is an evaluation of academic works that the applicants submit. That means that an external committee will evaluate those works, and they usually consist of the dissertation and perhaps another book, or at least um, a few articles in journals in addition to the dissertation. So the external evaluation scientific committee will look at the works and make an evaluation, and they will send that to the head of department. So I need to rely a lot on that committee, because I can't read through, let's say, 3,000-4,000 pages of academic works, and for the most part I won't be an expert on it either, because we hire people in all those different programs that I'm not an expert on. So I rely heavily on those reports, and that scientific committee will make a recommendation on and a ranking of the applicants, and a recommendation on who gets to move forward in to the interviews. And they do this not only based on the academic works, but also how the applicants match the call, the announcement of the position. So that could involve more things than just academic expertise. It might entail experience teaching. Now we often announce positions where we would like people with an experience in innovative teaching. So if you've developed new ways of teaching, tried out team-based learning or problem-based learning, inquiry-based learning, and perhaps even better, found new ways of applying technology in that process as well, that would be something they could bring into the equation. And also sometimes we have a language requirement, not as a requirement perhaps, but as a recommendation, that we are looking more for someone with a knowledge about Scandinavian languages. So it doesn't matter for us if you speak Swedish, Danish, or Norwegian, but for some positions we need someone who can have at least an initial knowledge about those languages for some positions. So after that process, we have the interviews and a sort of pedagogical test, a trial lecture. For some trial lectures, we would like to ask the applicants to do something innovative. For other programs, it's a more traditional lecture. And then we have the interview. And in the final end there, it's important for me in the interview to see a person that can match the work environment. So then we have moved on from being a brilliant scholar to also being someone that can participate in the work environment, which is something we regard very highly in Norway. So participating in lunches and seminars and being present. That's something that we can put a lot of emphasis on. That's not just important for us, but I want to find a good match between the applicant and the department, not just for us, but also for the applicant. I don't want to hire anyone who won't be happy here. So it's very important for me to have a happy staff. I think one of the best things we can offer is the ability to combine family life with an academic career, and I think that's quite unique in academia in Europe at the moment, where the work pressure is very high. We are able to accommodate that to some respects, and we have people coming from other countries who are well-established scholars, but they prefer coming to us because they have children and they would like to see the children. So I think that's that sort of fit between person and department. That's also part of the final assessment. So in the interviews, I look for people who see that. Of course, I hire people to European studies and to archaeology and everything. So it depends on what kind of personality I would like to see in the different programs. But I would like to see someone who would make a good fit for the people they will be working with. So someone who can be friends with their colleagues. That's important. Not necessarily friends in their spare time, but in the workplace, can have a friendly coffee and share ideas, encouraging their colleagues, helping their colleagues, saying yes to reading papers and being there as a good colleague. That kind of personalities is very important for me. So in the final end, all this is put together, and then it's very formal in the final hiring process. I can't just hire anyone I want. I need to show the hiring board and the dean that I have been loyal to the announcement. So whatever is said in the announcement, it needs to be documented that we have been loyal to that in the whole hiring process. So in my final recommendation to the hiring board, I sort of document that this has been a topic and an issue through the whole process, from the scientific committee to the trial lecture to the interviews and my final report. And I document that the applicants have been aware of this in the whole process. And so it's quite an open process. It's not something that I can just decide on my own whimsy. It's important to be loyal to the whole process. So it can be looked into by someone external. It won't be, that's being loyal to the transparency and the formalities is important in the end as well.
I think that Norwegian system is probably one of the only in the world where an applicant actually gets a report on his candidacy, from what I know, and that's probably a unique opportunity to get insight into what's going on within the hiring committee, at least on the level of academic assessment.
Yeah, and it also helps applicants to sort of improve for another round on another occasion, when you see how your works are evaluated. And of course, when you submit your application, you sort of make a presentation of yourself and the work, so you can sort of manipulate how it's been read by a committee. So learning how to sort of get the committee to read it like you want it to be read, that's also some learning you can draw from those reports.
If you were to advise people who are now considering academic career at different stages, maybe high school pupils who think about going and studying history, maybe master students who are thinking about PhD, or those who just finished their PhD and don't know whether to continue in academia or maybe to go outside, work in some other job that is relevant to history but not really academic career.
Mm. So for kids in school and perhaps students in the bachelor's, I would say that just enjoy your subjects is the most important thing. If you're not really, really, really interested in the subject, then you won't make it, because there are a lot of long hours, and you need to enjoy reading about Augustus, for instance, late at night. And if you don't enjoy it, then you won't. Then it's just the wrong decision to make, I think. So make sure that you enjoy academic work and enjoy reading. That's the most important thing, I think. For those who have finished masters, and especially those who have finished a PhD, I think uh, academia today is a lot about funding. It's a lot about projects. It's a lot about networks and showing that you're able to get funding. And I think for anyone who's applying for positions as associate professor in Norway the next years, they would really need to show that they're able to get funding for research. So that's something that we, as positions get more and more competitive, we are able to choose between applicants that have proven that they're able to do this. And of course, as a head of department, if I can choose between 5 people, the 2 persons who have got grants from Horizon Europe or ERC grants or anything like that, those 2 will be the most desirable people for me to hire, because they will they have shown that they can bring income to the department. And we know that the student numbers will decline in Norway for the next at least the next decade, because there are less children in schools. So that will imply a decrease in the student numbers. So we'll rely more on research now, and we'll rely more on external funding. I think this is the situation in Scandinavia overall. So at least in Scandinavia, yeah, saying yes to become part of projects is important. So you're able to get the experience on how these channels of funding work. It can be research councils or any other source of funding, but showing that you know how these work, you know how these are assessed, it's key in the years to come, I think.
Thank you very much for this conversation. I personally enjoyed very much talking to you about different aspects, also your own life and career, but also the hiring process part. I think it's important for people to know how those things work. And I hope that you enjoyed our conversation too.
It was very pleasurable. Thank you very much for the invitation.